So today I'm going to be talking to you about wet on dry and dry on wet. So we did some wet on wet stuff, and we did some graded washes and flat washes. I'm using this book as a reference for myself, just to kind of look at what this artist is doing. And he talks about how when you're combining wet on wet with wet on dry, that means you're either using wet paint on a wet surface or other wet paint, which tends to make the paint bleed, as you saw in the variegated wash, or allowing that to dry and be able to paint wet onto dry. So with watercolor, what happens is you get some bleeding effects, which is a beautiful thing in watercolor, and you want to do that wet on wet effect. But at times you really want to get these sharper edges, and you can't do that if something is wet. So like, let's say the negative space here in this mug. If I just painted this yellow, and then I go ahead and paint this black in the negative space, that line won't be there. It's going to start bleeding because watercolor paint goes where the water is or where the moisture is. And that is exactly what happened when I started mine. I was just playing around, and you can see that I had painted my negative space black, and then I was playing around with the yellowish tone in the mug. And what happened is that black negative space color bled right onto my mug, and that's not something that I wanted. But I thought, you know what, I'm gonna leave that and show you guys how you can fix that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my round brush, dip it in clean water, and I'm going to talk about that lifting technique that we talked about. So not only is a lifting technique used to create clouds and everything, but it's actually like almost like a whiteout of watercolor. What I can do is I have a lot of water. I'm going to rub that water on top of the color that I eventually want to lift. It may not get rid of it 100%, but as you can see already, just by dampening this area with that pool of water, you can see it's really lighting up. Now what I want to do is I want to rinse my brush, and I want to make sure that I'm getting all the moisture out of my brush so that I could sop that mess up, slurp it up, and lift it up. Now again, I think on better paper, it will lift a little bit better. I'm using the sketchbook paper today, and I'll be doing some other demonstrations on a little bit better. It's still student grade watercolor paper. Of course, more expensive. The higher the pound weight is of the paper, the better it is. But you could see that clearly made it so much better. Now it's at a point where I can rework that with another color, and I don't have that big black blob there, okay? So remember, I'm really using a light hand here, because if I scrub it too hard, that paper is just gonna fall apart on me. Now that this area is wet, I'm gonna continue to moisten the area really with just water at this point, because the paint will go where the water is. So I'm gonna go back in, do some more washes here. Like so. Now that that's moistened up, I can take some of my paint here, mix whatever color I want, and I can start blending that paint onto that wet area, getting more wet on wet technique effects, like so. Again, I'm just moving the paint around. I'm not trying to be too precise at this stage. Watercolor is supposed to be transparent. It's supposed to be loose up to a point, and built up, like I said, in major layers here. So we want to start off real thin. And I think, oh, see, there I go. I hit my negative space there again. I just said not to do it, and there I go doing it. I'm trying to paint that lemon or something that's in the background there. And now is not the time where I want to paint around these areas, because it'll bleed into the other color. So I'm not going to do the inside of the mug today or until it dries. I'm going to focus on other areas. Like I can focus back here and do what I want. I can do a wet on wet there. But I'm finding that this line is a little bit harsh, the contrast of the white. So I'm going to take a damp brush and kind of slurp that up so it's just not so much in contrast, the white against that color. I'm gonna kind of slurp that up. There we go. All right, so I can work on this background here because it's not next to the wet area. So I can continue doing some wet on wet techniques. do some other oranges, maybe mixed with a little red, maybe change it up a bit. So what I'm doing right now, this is wet on dry. You can see it's not bleeding. The paint is just sitting on the dry paper because this is dry here. So I have a lot more control. So I can really come up close to the edge of this mug at this point. Then I can blend it. But if you're doing wet on dry, what you don't want to do is you never want this edge to dry. If you let this edge dry, there's always going to be that line there. So you want to kind of move around the paint while it's still wet. And I just added more water right now because I was thinking, oh, that's a little dark. I'm just pushing it around with a little water. Try not to be too perfect about it. At this point, I can even add a little other color, a little more yellow. Do a wet on wet, just kind of dab it around. Notice how when I'm doing my brush, I can use the pointed end to get a very thin line. I can press my brush down to get a thicker line. So that's why you don't need a whole bunch of different brushes, because the one brush kind of does a lot of stuff, okay? Now this one here, I want to talk about masking. And masking is when you cover an area to protect it. So those of you that have ever painted a house or seen your parents paint a house and they use that tape to make sure that they're masking that area out so that it doesn't get on the trim. That's what we're doing. We're using masking tape. I drew just kind of like a quick building. I didn't have a photo reference. I'm making it up. Quick building, and I want that roof to be really white. So I covered it up with masking tape. That way, I don't have to worry about painting around it like I was with the mug. I was so worried about painting around it. Where this way, I can just slough the paint all over and it's never going to get on that rooftop, because once I paint it, I can peel that off. It's going to be white. The other thing I did use is that frisket, or that stuff, the frisket, which is masking fluid, and I used it to dab on some things. I thought, oh, if I'm going to have some flowers there, I want to keep that area nice and light so it looks like some light is actually hitting that area. So we're going to kind of combine techniques. I'm showing you the masking tape, I'm showing you the masking fluid, and the other thing that you can use is the oil pastel. So a white oil pastel, you're going to want to make sure it's clean. This is a little schmaggy, so I want to clean that, otherwise it's going to leave some marks on there. I'm just going to kind of scribble some of this oil pastel around on the white paper. You can hardly see it now. You could probably write a note to a friend in code, and then they in order for them to reveal it, they can put the watercolor on top. What I'm going to do now is show you how this works here. Let's go with like a reddish sunset kind of sky. Let me get some water here. I might even dampen the area first, like I showed you in the other video. Just kind of dampen this first, because paint likes going where the moisture is. Okay, so my water's a little dirty, so you might see a little bit of orange there. But now I'm really going to hit that with color. And as you can see already, as I'm going over this area where there is the oil pastel is tending to resist the color. Not 100%, but it's resisting it a little bit. The tape is definitely protecting the roof of this house. And when we go over, let's say with like a yellow here, you can see those little bumps staying there. What's going to happen with this masking fluid is I have to wait until my paint dries entirely, and then I can use just my thumb and rub that stuff off, and you'll have white dots left there. And I will show you that. Everything with watercolor is so many different stages, right? I'm going to hit this with a little green down there. Maybe even hit it with a little blue. They say you really shouldn't paint right out of the tube. Like, you don't want a yellow flower with a green stem and a blue sky. It'll start to look a little cartoony. So you want to make sure that you're mixing. Get some yellow greens, get some different tones of greens, get some different intensity of greens. All right? At this point, we can do a little more wet on wet. Even though kind of creating like stems of a plant, it's still very blurry. The key is to start off not very detailed and then work your way with the wet on wet technique, and then work your way into it with the dry on wet technique after, so it'll get more detailed as we move on. I've also got a little bit of the masking fluid around this window here. I'm mixing a little brown with a little blue because I want that brown to be like paint brown. I want it to be toned down a bit. And so I'm going to use my brush and just go over that. And that window will appear. I'm not getting right to the edge at this point because, again, if I paint, watch, if I paint right next to that green, that's going to bleed. So you do have to do things in stages. If you don't mind a little bit of bleeding at first, that's fine. You could do that and you can go, oh no, I messed up, and I could soak it up later. But right now I think it's fine. I see a little puddle happening here. So what I want to do is slurp that up a little bit. I think it's getting a little too much, or you can use a towel. You can also get some fun textures that way. Like that. So I'm going to let that dry and come back and show you what else I could do with this. Now that this is dried a little bit, I can go back in and I can work with the wet on dry. It's dry to the touch. I'm not worried about anything bleeding. I want to get some of those details that I see in here, like the shadows. I can start laying those in inside of the mug. So we'll take a little bit of black, maybe with a little bit of blue and orange. They say never to use pure black. I keep saying they. I don't know who they are, but the experts, I guess. I'm going to do what is called wet on dry now. So I can control this paint the way I want, and I don't have to worry about it going into my other colors. It's not going to bleed or blend in like it did with the variegated wash or the wet on wet. Now that's kind of too strong of a shadow, so what I do is I rinse my brush and I kind of start diluting this and playing around. Again, dabbing my brush, slurping some of that up. Might be a little too strong. I do want my edges crisp, so I want to take my time on that, but then I can lift some of that so it's not so strong, like so. And you'll notice that watercolor paint, as it dries a lot lighter than you originally put it on. So I put it on so that the edges around the mug are nice and dark, and then I'm kind of lifting it as we go over here. I want to put like a stronger shadow on this side here. Do the same thing. Really get that edge the way I want it. Each time you put a new layer on, you may use less transparent paint, which means less water. So I want to get like a nice edge to this. It depends. See how tight I am to the barrel of the brush here? If I want more detail, if I hold it back here, I'm not going to get very good detail. I'm not going to be able to control that. I want to hold it like this if I'm doing some of the washes and the wet on wet. But if I want to get detail, I want to move my hand up on that barrel of the brush a little more. Like so. Get the strong shadow down here. And then I can start blending this away. I'm just going to, for time's sake, I might even end up blending out that other mug there. Or I can keep it. We can tell later. See how I'm just using a little water, dampening my brush and then blotting it. And you can still see the color underneath, which is nice. But now I'm getting that nice crisp edge of this mug. Got the nice crisp edge of the inside of the mug. And then I can start working around. Like this. I think I will just forget about that other mug right now. Always change things up a little bit there. I think I need some more shadow there. Now you can see that my edge of my background when I was playing, I didn't quite get enough around the edge of the mug there, and because it's dry, I can do that a little bit. Strengthen that up a little bit over there. Real slow around the edges, looser around negative space. Now this is nowhere near finished, but you can see that it's really starting to build up with darker and less opaque layers. Put like a cool shadow on the edge of the mug here, like this. Just kind of leave that, like so. All right, so that was using the wet on wet, the dry on wet, so you can kind of see how I'm building up the painting. I can push this a lot further. Now this one here that I did the masking, it's not totally dry, but it's getting there. But I don't want to peel the tape off or peel this off because I'm not done working the area yet. I still want to play around. I might want to add a little bit more color, building up the painting. We started with a real light and transparent wash. Now I want to start adding a little bit more detail. Okay, so I think I'm going to add a little more red. But it's important to plan out your whites. That's why we did this masking, because you're not supposed to go back in with white paint on top. You could if you made a major mistake, but the idea behind watercolor is that you are pre-planning. You have to know where your whites are, and you want to protect those whites. That sky's a little more interesting now. I can mix some greens. I don't want a bright green. A bright green looks like crayon. It looks too bright, too intense. So how do we make a color less intense? Well, even if I just put a little of that purple in, it'll darken it. But if I want that green less intense, I'm gonna add a little red to it because it's its complementary color. It'll make it not so cartoony. Okay, so now I'm gonna do the wet on dry technique. You could see how much that blended. And those lines that I made earlier, they just kind of went away, but it adds for a nice texture. Now, I can add texture with the wet on dry technique. Putting a nice shadow underneath the roof line. Another cool technique is using my X-Acto knife. Take my X-Acto knife while the paint's wet right now. I have a nice sharp X-Acto knife, and I just start scraping into the paint to get kind of like some barn board effects. Where I've scratched it, you could tell that that paint is getting, it goes into the scratched part of the paper and it makes it dark. So you can do that instead of trying to paint these thin lines, you can scratch them in. You can also scratch before you paint. So if I say I want some areas here, some lines to act as stems, and then I go and paint a little wash over that, you'll see some of those lines appear there. Okay? Float some lighter color on there. Now if I wanted to paint flowers on here, and if I tried doing the red, it'll be like those little sunbursts. It'll start bleeding and blending. But if I do it on the dry area, it stays. But if I do it in the wet area, it blends and bleeds. We'll come back to this again. Another cool technique is called splatter and spray. So if I dip my toothbrush into some paint, I can flick the brush and get some really cool textures. Splattering and masking go really well together because sometimes you don't want a certain area splattered. So that tape will totally protect it. So you can see I'm getting some really cool effects there. You can try different colors, try the paint a little thin, try splattering wet on wet, try splattering wet on dry. Get some cool effects there. Even though it's still a little wet, I'm going to go in back in the horizon line there. I'm going to add some trees off in the distance. My paint's still pretty transparent at this point. I don't want it too dark because, as you know, when things are further away in the distance, they're not very detailed and they're not very dark. This is kind of really setting up nicely, starting to feel like a sense of space. This is way back off in the distance. Got the sun setting, got my roof all masked. You can even try mixing some of these colors. Like right now I have kind of a purple barn. You can mix a little of those other colors in there, which will bring harmony to the rest of the painting. Like I said, water doesn't have to be blue. Skies don't have to be blue. Tree trunks don't have to be brown. And kind of start adding some of the colors in the other areas. Shadow here, because obviously the sun's behind. Shadow might be a little bit darker along the edge. Rinse out the brush. Start pulling that away from the barn. Lifting some of it if you feel like it's too much. At this point, it's still a little damp, but I think I'm going to create some more textures. It's bleeding a little bit because it's damp, which I like. But then I can go back in and even add more of a wet on dry technique. Still a little bit of bleeding happening. It's okay, it kind of shows depth and space. Not so much over here, because it's dry. So it's wet on dry, wet on wet. Maybe the background's a little too dark in areas, so I can use my lift technique. Moisten that area up. Take a tissue and blotch. Remember, don't scrub. It's just lifting it up light enough so that it's not all the same value. Another cool effect is called stamping. You take a paper towel or a sponge. Remember earlier I showed you a sponge? You can use a sponge, especially, well, there's a little bit of my dog hair on there, sorry. Use a little of the sponge that has a nice texture, or even a paper towel, and crunch it up so you have nice texture, and then you dab that into the paint, and you can stamp some textures onto that as well. That's pretty cool. Remember, with acrylic paint, I was teaching you, always work from dark to light. With watercolor paints, you have to plan out your whites, protect them, and then work light to dark. So you're working in your transparent layers. I had done that atmospheric perspective green wet on wet wash back there, and now that that's kind of drying, I'm taking a darker color, darker tone, and I'm creating trees that are maybe a little bit more in the foreground that are in front of those trees that are back there. So they're going to be a little bit darker, a little bit more detailed. Like that. Again, this is starting to dry a little bit, so I can start doing a little wet on dry technique. Add a little bit more shadow to the barn and underneath the barn as well. So this is really in the foreground here. Some grasses maybe blocking our view of some of the flowers that we see in the middle ground. And it's all tying in, the darks, the oranges, the greens. At this point I could probably add a little bit more color to the flowers, but it's not going to bleed too much. And remember, I still have some masking fluid under here. So once I rub that off, I'm going to have areas of white. Not too much. The roof right now, once I take the tape off, will be white. The window frame will be white. And there's some white speckles in here. We can always use the spattering technique, maybe with a little white acrylic paint if we wanted to add a little bit more lighter value to that at some point. I will have to let this dry, and then I'll show you how to take off the masking tape and how to rub the masking fluid off. So I got impatient and actually blow dried my paint here because I'm anxious to take off that masking tape and that masking fluid. So with the masking tape, if you can reach under it and grab it with your fingernail, that's great. Or you can use the X-Acto knife or something else to help you pry it open. Pry it up, I mean. But I think I can get my fingernail underneath there. And watch this. So satisfying. So I'm going to peel back this tape and reveal that really nice white roof. Or as we say in the States sometimes, roof. Look at that white roof. Look at that. Totally clean, sharp edges. Looks great. It might be too white, so we might have to put some kind of a wash into it at some point. Let's use our, look at that nail. See what happens when you're an artist? Get paint on your nail. Let's start rubbing this masking fluid off of the window. It just rolls away. Just push it with your finger until you get all of that latexy kind of thing off. Look at that. Really, really white protected it. I don't love the shape. Could I go back in and crisp up those edges? I sure can. Now let's see what happens with the masking fluid that we put here. Now again, I think I might have done the shapes a little too large, but I wanted to have some kind of whitish flower over here. Probably if this wasn't just a demonstration, I probably would have put it in other areas. I just wanted to show you that. So now that that's all rubbed off, the tape's off, we can go back in and rework that. I can go back in and say, you know, I might hold my hand so I'm nice and steady to get a nice sharp edge on that window, or do I like how it looks loose? I'm not worried about it being perfect, that's for sure. That looks a little better. Now it looks a little too outlined, so I'm just going to push some of that back. Blend it into the rest of the barn. That looks cool. And I can go back in with some reds, some yellows or oranges. And get rid of some of that. Maybe it's too much white, but it's nice to have some of that white showing. I think I would have liked that throughout the artwork actually. But what's weird, watercolor, even though it's transparent, you can sometimes put the lighter color on top of a darker color, and it will do some blocking. So let's say I didn't love that white roof. I could put a very, very thin, I was gonna do blue, but you know, if it's kind of like a metal roof, it might be reflecting the orange in the sky. So I might want to just put a very, very little bit of a wash of that. Maybe a little bit of purple too. Not too much. I can always lift it a bit. But it was nice because I didn't have to paint around this when I was painting the sky. I was able to just whip right over it because it's protected. Oh, there goes that bleeding, see? Because I painted wet next to something that's wet. So not going to panic. Just gonna lift that up a little bit. I'm gonna go like really dry brushing when I take a lot of the paint off my brush, And then I kind of just add some scumbling like you learn in grade 10. Yeah, just give it a little bit of texture. So there you go. You've learned masking tape. We did the oil pastel here. I don't think it worked that great on this paper, so that's the white crayon resist. The masking fluid we used here and on the window. We did some lifting on the sky. We did a lot of wet on wet here. We did wet on dry, which is the wet on top of the dry paint. We splattered with a toothbrush, and we also used that sgraffito or scraping with the X-Acto knife. I didn't label that, but that's in this area here on the barn, as well as in the flowers here. So I hope you've learned a lot. I hope you play around. You can either copy my picture, just try it on your own, and you can see how to build up a painting using some of these techniques.